Hi friends, today we're doing Unit 8, Lesson 8, Native Americans of the Northeast. We're going to start by going over the key vocabulary words that you'll be hearing in today's reading. Our first word is shamans, people who heal the sick and communicates with spirits. Our second word is wigwam, a hut made by covering a framework of wooden poles with bark or animal hides. We're now going to move into today's reading. The journey for some native peoples took them to the northeastern part of America, to the abundant, leafy woodlands and deep, dark forests that stretched from Canada and the Great Lakes south to the Carolinas, and from the Atlantic Ocean on the east coast west to the Mississippi River. This was a time long before Europeans came and made their mark upon the land. This was a time when some native peoples made the forest their home and lived in long-term balance with their environment. Unlike in the Southwest, rain fell, as it still does, more frequently upon most of this land. The native peoples of this region did not believe there was a need to call upon the assistance of gods for rain to soak the earth and make the crops grow. And just as today, in this region of the eastern woodlands, each season brought with it a different climate and a changing earth. The same freshwater rivers and lakes, the same imposing mountains and forests, color the landscape today as they did back then. As you have already learned, some of the earliest people to settle across this region were the mound builders, whose culture lasted for thousands of years. They spread out from the Mississippi River and lived on the surrounding land, hunting in the forests and utilizing the abundant natural resources available to them. The people who settled in this area are known as the Eastern Woodland Indians. After hundreds of years of nomadic existence, other groups of people bound by family connections formed themselves into tribes. In fact, the Eastern Woodland Indians were made up of numerous tribes. Some of these tribes included the Iroquois, Mohican, and Powhatan. Over time, these tribes established their own cultural identities, which included a range of languages spoken throughout this large area. The Eastern Woodland Indians often interacted with each other. Sometimes their interactions were peaceful, at other times they were not. These tribes relied on the land for their very existence. They guarded their villages, their hunting lands, their crops, and their settlements from invasion by neighboring tribes. Some scientists believe that wars may have been the result of an era around 500 to 1,000 years ago when the climate changed considerably. A harsh mini ice age swept across the world. This occurred thousands and thousands of years after many scientists think the Beringia crossing took place. During this time, when food was scarce and it was difficult to survive, tribal wars broke out and brought about the deaths of many young warriors and the destruction of tribal villages. Finally, in search of peace, these tribes joined together to form the Iroquois nation, also called the Iroquois Confederacy. As they negotiated or discussed how they would live peacefully together, they often smoked a peace pipe. As you have heard, the Iroquois did not call themselves by this name. They called themselves Haudenosaunee, or people of the Longhouse. The Iroquois people were actually 5 separate tribes: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Seneca, and the Cayuga, that inhabited a particular part of the eastern woodland region. They lived largely in what is now New York and Ohio. Once a year, sachems or chiefs from each of the tribes, who were always men but always chosen by women, would meet in a council to make new laws and deal with any new problems that arose. As with all native peoples, the landscape helped shape the Iroquois culture. It greatly influenced what kind of houses they built, what clothes they wore, what food they ate, how they traveled, what weapons they had, what tools they used, what gods they worshipped, and even what language they spoke. A typical home for many eastern woodland Indians depended more on climate and available resources than anything else. The 3 most familiar kinds of homes across the Northeast region were the longhouse, the wigwam, and a round-roofed clay and pole structure. Because the winter months were generally cold with deep snow covering much of the ground, many eastern woodland Indians, including the Iroquois, constructed wigwams and longhouses. Wigwams were rounded structures that looked similar to wooden igloos and were homes in which individual families lived. The longhouse and the wigwam were made almost entirely from wood. In the colder regions of the north, especially around the Great Lakes, native peoples constructed wigwams that could be easily dismantled so that the tribes could, for part of the year, live a nomadic life. During this time of the year, they followed the herds they hunted for their survival. To build a wigwam, young trees were cut down and bent over to form a rounded frame. Tree bark was placed over the frame. Grasses were then added to help insulate the home. A small hole in the roof allowed smoke from the fire inside the home to escape. The family cooked their food on an open fire and slept on mats. In the wintertime, they used animal furs to keep themselves warm. Longhouses were much larger than wigwams and were home to several families that were related to each other. The Iroquois considered themselves to be related to each other through the mothers in the tribe. This extended family group was called a clan. Each clan had an animal name. When a young couple married, they went to live with the bride's family. Some longhouses ranged in size from 50 feet to 150 feet long and housed as many as 50 people. To construct a longhouse, once again, a frame was made using young trees. Bark was placed over the frame and was then sewn together. The longhouse had a large central hallway with rooms on either side. The family members slept on sleeping platforms. Some Iroquois still build longhouses today for ceremonies. Just like other tribes, the Iroquois made baskets and pots in which to store food. The Iroquois grew different varieties of corn and beans. They also grew squash, sunflowers, and tobacco. They cleared the land of trees and shrubs and planted their crops. Corn, beans, and squash were particularly important crops, and the Iroquois referred to them as the Three Sisters. Like members of a family, the three plants helped each other grow. By planting these three plants together, the Iroquois relied on the natural relationships among these plants. The corn stalks provided a support for the bean plants, which would wind around the corn stalks. The squash leaves that lay on the ground prevented weeds and increased the amount of rainwater that was absorbed into the soil. Also, the bean plants produced a natural bacteria that made the soil more fertile for the corn and squash plants. In the wintertime, when food was scarce, many Iroquois left their villages to hunt. They moved with the herds and often did not return to their villages until early spring. The Iroquois hunted deer using bows and arrows. Young boys cloaked themselves in deerskin as they stealthily crept through the forest in pursuit of their prey. They also hunted smaller mammals, setting traps to catch them. In addition, the Iroquois fished and gathered berries and tapped the trees to get maple syrup. Yes, the Iroquois had a sweet tooth too. Like many other tribes, the Iroquois lived near water. Water was a source of life, and it provided a means of transportation. The Iroquois traveled in dugout canoes. They fished using nets and traps. Depending on the weather, the Iroquois wore a range of clothing. In the summer, the men wore a breechcloth, which was a short piece of buckskin. Women wore dresses made of grass fibers. And in the wintertime, everyone relied on animals' furs to keep warm. Men also wore buckskin moccasins on their feet. They used dyes, beads, and quills to decorate their clothes, as well as their skin. Very important to the Iroquois was something called wampum. Wampum was an artistic way of communicating important thoughts and decisions. Wampum was belts and necklaces made from colored shells. The color and design of the beads could tell a story, or they could be a symbolic means of communication. Wampum could also be used when trading. It was therefore a kind of currency. Wampum was considered to be very valuable and was an important part of Iroquois culture. The Iroquois, like many other eastern woodland Indians, believed in a spirit world that was governed by the Great Spirit. For the Iroquois, the Great Spirit was called Orenda. They also believed in an evil spirit too. The Iroquois believed that everything had a spirit and that all living things on earth were connected. They believed that it was their responsibility to care for the earth. Each season brought with it special Iroquois ceremonies. The Iroquois had shamans, or holy men. It was believed that shamans could communicate with the spirit world. Shamans were thought to have special powers to do such things as cure the sick, bring about a good harvest, or bring victory to a tribe going to war. And so, the Iroquois, as well as other eastern woodland Indians, lived out their lives in this way. They told stories and celebrated their history, they worshiped the Great Spirit, and they lived in harmony with the land and all living creatures. Today, many Iroquois continue to follow and honor their traditional ways. Amazingly, some still build longhouses for ceremonies, and their leaders meet to guard and protect their ancient culture. You may now move on to Unit 8, Lesson 8, Google Form.